welcome to the deep dive. We're diving into something pretty thought-provoking today.
Yeah.
It's this whole idea of the relationship between, well, what people often call the Western and the Jewish intellectual traditions.
Okay, got it. Big topic.
And, you gave us these excerpts from Athens with Jerusalem.
Right.
That book really gets into this.
It does.
And it seems like what we're really exploring here is how Jewish voices and those texts, how they've been treated or maybe not treated within liberal arts education.
Yeah, that's a big part of it.
There's a lot to unpack.
Absolutely. Where do we even start?
Well, the book uses this phrase. It really sticks with you. The silence of Jerusalem.
Right. Powerful, isn't it?
And it's talking about how Jewish representation is kind of lacking.
Yeah, and how we traditionally think about what makes a well-rounded, liberal arts education.
So why is it so silent? I mean, were Jewish thinkers just sort of accidentally left out of the conversation?
It's definitely more complicated than just an accident. The source points to a few different historical reasons.
Okay.
Some are more deliberate than others.
Like what?
Well, there's evidence of some, straight-up anti-Semitism.
Oh, wait, why?
Within academia, even.
I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but...
Including things like admissions quotas.
At universities?
Yeah, at certain universities.
To limit Jewish enrollment?
Unfortunately, yes.
That's awful, to think of that reaching into education like that.
Yeah. And then beyond just who was allowed in,
right,
there's also the question of what was even considered, worthy of study. Some scholars really actively argued against including Jewish thought at all, saying it was just too different from the Western tradition, like impossible to reconcile.
So it was like separate but equal, but with ideas.
Kind of. A very distinct separation. And then even when Jewish thinkers were considered, it was often through this very specific lens,
Right, the source mentions that.
Yeah.
How Jewish texts were presented, often through a Western.
Yeah.
And often a specifically Christian perspective.
Exactly. And the author of Athens with Jerusalem, they argue that this really, really changes how we understand things.
Oh, I bet.
They make this comparison. It's like trying to understand a recipe.
Okay.
But you're only allowed to read the footnotes.
That's a great analogy. You'd miss the whole point.
Exactly. You miss the core of the dish.
You'd be missing all the good stuff.
You got it.
Okay, so this sort of leads us to what the book calls the great books problem.
Right.
Which seems like a big core example of this. What's the problem exactly?
Well, you know how great books curricula are still pretty influential.
Yeah, and a lot of programs.
Right. They're seen as this gold standard of a liberal arts education. But even when there are attempts to diversify these lists, Jewish texts still left out.
Yeah.
They might add works from, other non-Western traditions.
Right.
But Jerusalem, still silent.
So it's not about just adding more books.
Yeah.
It's about whose voices are there.
You got it.
The book gives that example, the debates about whether Chaucer belongs in the canon, right? While at the same time, you have all these medieval Jewish poets who are arguably just as worthy?
At least.
But they're just absent.
Yeah.
So how do we even define worthy in this context?
That's a big question.
It is. What are we even missing by not having those other voices?
It's a crucial question the source really wants us to think about.
Okay, so how do we answer it?
Well, to show us what we might be missing, the book really digs into specifics. Specific areas where the Jewish tradition has these really unique, valuable perspectives.
Okay, I'm listening.
So let's start with, grammar.
Grammar, okay.
We often think about grammar, through the lens of Greek and Roman authors.
That makes sense.
But the source highlights these Hebrew scribes called the Masoretes.
Masoretes. Okay, tell me about them. What's so special about them?
Well, their dedication to the Hebrew Bible, it was incredible. They developed this intricate system of, vocalization and annotations to preserve the text.
To preserve the text, keep it accurate.
Exactly, to make sure the meaning stayed true. This wasn't just, grammar rules for the sake of it.
Right.
It was more about safeguarding the text, the transmission of knowledge even, across generations.
Wow, so it was about, precision.
Yes.
Making sure every word, every little nuance, it all got carried forward.
Exactly. And that's so characteristic, this reverence for the text, this need to maintain its integrity. It's really at the heart of the Jewish tradition's whole approach to language.
It makes me think about, oral traditions.
Oh, yeah.
How stories, teachings are passed down through generations. that takes a similar kind of care, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
To make sure nothing gets lost or changed.
You're so right. And the source even touches on this too, actually.
Does it?
Yeah, the Jewish tradition, it has this strong emphasis on oral transmission of knowledge.
Right.
And that's definitely shaped how it approaches grammar.
So it sounds like there's a different kind of emphasis there.
Definitely.
Than in the Western grammatical tradition.
For sure. And, that leads us to another area where the source highlights a key difference.
Oh, which one?
Rhetoric.
Okay, rhetoric. You mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
The whole speaking well versus speaking up.
Right. That contrast.
It really jumped out at me.
Well, the source makes this direct comparison, okay?
Okay.
Between the Western emphasis on eloquence, and persuasive speech.
Right. Yeah.
They're think of someone like Cicero, a classic orator.
Mm-hmm.
And they compare that with how the Jewish tradition approaches rhetoric.
How so?
It's more about speaking truth to power, which shows up, in prophetic speech.
Oh, interesting. Like the prophets in the Hebrew Bible.
Exactly. Figures like, say, Amos,
yeah.
or Isaiah, they weren't afraid to challenge authority.
Even if it was risky.
Even at a huge personal risk. Their speech, it wasn't about winning an argument or sounding elegant.
No.
It was about delivering a powerful message.
Yeah.
Often one of warning or social critique.
The source has some pretty vivid examples, right?
Yeah.
Of how the prophets use language.
Yeah.
With this really strong imagery.
Oh, yeah.
And that directness, which could be pretty confrontational.
Totally. It wasn't about being diplomatic, that's for sure.
Not at all, yeah. So the source is saying that comes from a fundamentally different place.
Yeah.
A different understanding of the purpose of language.
100%. In the Western tradition, rhetoric, it's often seen as a tool.
A tool.
For personal gain, persuasion, achieving your own goals.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
But in the Jewish tradition,
yeah,
there's this strong emphasis on speech having this higher moral purpose.
Interesting.
It's a vehicle for truth, for justice, even if it's unpopular.
Kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, doesn't it?
You think so?
With the Masoretes. And that care for the text. Like there's this sense of responsibility for the power of language.
That's a great connection. And that actually leads to maybe the most intriguing difference the source digs into. How these two traditions approach thinking itself.
Okay, I'm ready. What's so different about how they approach thinking?
Well, the source suggests that while the Western intellectual tradition, it often prioritizes seeing, reason, and logic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The Jewish tradition, it has this unique emphasis on hearing.
Hearing. So instead of starting with like a question or hypothesis, you start by listening.
Exactly. It's less about actively trying to figure things out.
Right.
And more about being open to receiving knowledge.
That is fascinating.
Isn't it? The source actually compares it to Socrates' allegory of the cave.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Where knowledge is all about emerging from this darkness into the light.
Right, right.
But in the Jewish tradition, it often centers around the spoken word. Receiving wisdom from a source outside ourselves.
That makes me think of the giving of the Torah.
At Mount Sinai.
Yeah. Where they heard God's voice. That's a pretty powerful example.
It is. A perfect example, really. And this different starting point.
Yeah.
It can lead to very different ways of approaching thinking itself. The source argues that the Jewish tradition really emphasizes humility and awe.
As, like, key parts of understanding.
As essential elements.
So it's not about rejecting reason or logic, right?
Oh, no, not at all.
It's about balancing it.
Yes. With other ways of knowing. Recognizing that we don't always have all the answers.
Okay, this all makes sense, but it feels a bit abstract.
I get that.
Can you give me, like, a concrete example? What would a listening-based approach to thinking look like?
Sure. Let's look at the concept of midrash.
Midrash.
It's a central part of Jewish textual interpretation. It's about engaging deeply with a text.
Okay.
Listening carefully for the different layers of meaning. And even having a dialogue with the text itself. It's not just analyzing what's on the surface.
Right.
It's about uncovering deeper levels of understanding through careful listening.
Yeah.
And interpretation.
So it's almost like having a conversation.
With the text.
Yeah, like you're trying to hear what it has to say.
That's such a great way to put it.
Beyond just the literal words.
Exactly. And the source argues that this approach can be applied to any text or idea, not just religious ones. It's about approaching knowledge with humility, with openness, being willing to listen deeply and engage with all these different perspectives.
This makes me wonder, what would a liberal arts education even look like? If it truly embraced this whole multifaceted approach, what would it mean to learn not just from Athens, but from Jerusalem as well?
That's a huge question.
It is?
The source doesn't give us, a complete blueprint.
Okay.
But it does offer some intriguing possibilities.
Like what?
Imagine a curriculum, right?
Yeah.
Where you're not just reading, say, Plato and Aristotle.
Right.
But also the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud, writings from medieval Jewish philosophers.
Like Maimonides.
Yes, like Maimonides.
That would be incredible.
Wouldn't it?
To see how those different traditions have tackled similar questions.
Throughout history.
Yeah. And to see the history of ideas in such a richer, more nuanced way.
Absolutely. And it would challenge students to think in totally new ways, to grapple with these different approaches to knowledge, to understanding, and just appreciate the complexity of intellectual history.
It wouldn't be easy, though, would it?
No.
To truly engage with all those diverse perspectives, ways of thinking.
Not at all. But the potential rewards, they're enormous.
They could help us move beyond those, those simple binaries.
Right.
Embrace something more holistic, a more interconnected understanding of human knowledge.
Exactly. It's like the source is calling for a kind of intellectual humility.
Humility.
Yeah. A recognition that no single tradition has a monopoly on truth or wisdom.
Right, right.
And the source reminds us that engaging with multiple perspectives,
it can lead to a much deeper understanding of the world, a more meaningful one, too.
So far, we've talked about what's been missing.
We have. The silence of Jerusalem.
Right. But the source also offers some glimpses, right?
It does.
Of what that missing voice actually sounds like.
You're right. The book, it goes beyond those theoretical critiques.
Okay.
It gives specific examples of how the Jewish tradition actually engages with these core elements of a liberal arts education.
It does.
Yeah, we actually get to hear that different way of thinking and speaking.
I like that. Give me some examples. What are some of those unique elements that it brings?
Okay, well, in terms of grammar, we see this incredible focus on precision, on detail. In the work of the Masoretes, remember them?
Yeah.
They weren't just grammarians.
No.
They were guardians of the text, making sure every word, every nuance was transmitted faithfully across generations.
It's almost like they were building a bridge.
A bridge between the past and the present, making sure the wisdom of, previous generations, it could still speak to us today.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And then when it comes to rhetoric, we see this powerful emphasis on speaking truth to power, on prophetic speech that challenges, the status quo and calls for justice.
The source uses those examples of the prophets,
right,
like Amos and Isaiah, who weren't afraid to speak out
against injustice,
even if it was dangerous.
Exactly. And their words still resonate today. They remind us that silence in the face of oppression, it's not an option.
It's not. And that commitment, to speaking truth, using language for a higher purpose.
Right.
It seems connected to that listening-based approach we were talking about.
Totally.
Like it's about receiving wisdom from outside yourself and then using your voice to share it, to challenge injustice.
Absolutely. The Jewish tradition, it emphasizes humility, deep respect for tradition, and it's acknowledging we don't have all the answers. That true wisdom, it often comes from listening, from being open to what's being revealed.
That's such an important message.
Isn't it?
Especially today.
Yeah.
When everything is about, individual achievement.
Yeah.
Self-reliance.
It's a much-needed counterpoint.
Yeah.
And it's something that the liberal arts really need.
So if we were to sum up the source's argument here, what's the key takeaway?
I think it's this. The Western intellectual tradition, at least as it's traditionally been understood, it's incomplete.
Incomplete.
Without the Jewish voice.
Without Jerusalem.
Yes. By excluding Jerusalem, we're limiting ourselves. We're missing out on a whole world of insights and perspectives that could make our understanding of language, thinking, even just living, so much richer.
It's not about replacing Athens with Jerusalem.
No.
It's about bringing them together.
Creating that dialogue.
Right, to let both traditions shine, illuminate each other.
Exactly. And I think the source makes a strong case for why that's so important.
Yeah.
Not just for academics, but for anyone who wants to engage with those big questions.
The really fundamental stuff.
Yes, the stuff that's shaped our world.
It's a call to broaden our horizons.
Yeah.
To challenge our assumptions.
Right.
And to listen with open hearts and minds. It reminds us that I don't know, maybe really understanding something, it comes from engaging with all those different perspectives. Being open to voices that, challenge us.
I totally agree. And the source makes this point, that it's not just intellectually enriching, this engagement, but it can be ethically and spiritually transformative.
Oh, wow.
It pushes us to think about not just what we think, but how we think.
Right.
And how those ways of thinking shape our understanding of the world and where we fit into it.
So bringing this back to our listener who's been on this deep dive with us, what would you say is the biggest takeaway? If they walk away from this with just one insight, what would it be?
I think it's that, recognizing that knowledge, it's never really static or complete. It's always evolving. Dialogue, debate, and including those different perspectives. The silence of Jerusalem that the source talks about. It's not just a historical fact.
Right.
It's an ongoing challenge for all of us. We have this responsibility to listen for those voices that are missing, to seek out those perspectives that challenge our own, and just contribute to this richer, more inclusive understanding of the world.
It's like true knowledge. It's not just about facts.
Yeah.
It's about this process of learning and questioning and just expanding how we understand things.
Yes, exactly. And I think this deep dive, it's given us a great example of how that can happen by looking at the Jewish intellectual tradition, what it has to offer.
Which is often overlooked.
Totally.
Yeah.
We get this richer, more nuanced understanding of the liberal arts, the history of ideas, even the nature of knowledge itself.
Well said. And for our listener, this is just the beginning, right?
It is.
It started on something fascinating, and there's so much more to explore. So, as you keep going with these ideas, think about what a truly inclusive liberal arts education would even look like. In the 21st century, even.
Oh, that's a good one.
How can we hold these different traditions? Athens and Jerusalem. Reason and revelation, seeing and hearing. How can we hold those in tension?
In a productive tension.
Yes, exactly. And what might come from that? What new insights, what possibilities?
Those are such great questions, and I really hope our listener keeps wrestling with those as they go deeper. The journey, it never really ends. And I think for you, listener, it's just begun.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
It has.
I feel like we've all learned so much. I'm sure our listener has too. We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully we've, maybe sparked some curiosity. And that desire to keep exploring these ideas because they're complex, they're fascinating, they're important.